Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be diving into kind of a turbulent period in American history, Reconstruction. We're going to focus on Louisiana in the 1870s and also explore the nationwide economic crisis that was happening around the same time, the Panic of 1873. Our main source for this deep dive is an episode of the American History Tellers podcast.
Okay.
And you know what's interesting is we're going to see how like a local massacre and a national financial meltdown are kind of connected.
Right.
And how they both really played a part in undermining Reconstruction efforts. So that's kind of our mission today.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period because you see the fragility of progress. Reconstruction, for those who need a little refresher, was that period after the Civil War, when the nation was trying to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society. But by 1873, the North's commitment to, protecting black rights was kind of fading.
Yeah.
And this huge economic depression was looming.
So the stage is set for conflict. And the American History Tellers episode really brings to life one of the most brutal examples of this. The Kfax massacre in Grant Parish, Louisiana. And, I mean, the name massacre kind of tells you things are bad.
Right.
What happened?
Well, the story really starts with a disputed election in 1872.
Yeah.
Both the Republican and Democrat candidates for governor claimed victory in Louisiana. And get this, they even held separate inaugurations.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a recipe for chaos.
Yeah.
And this confusion trickled down to local elections, too, setting the scene for violence in places like Grant Parish.
So it's not just a political divide, it's almost like two rival governments claiming legitimacy.
Yeah.
And what makes this so dangerous is that the Republicans at this time were generally the party supporting black rights, while the Democrats were largely the party of the former Confederacy.
Exactly. So you had this underlying current of racial tension fueling the political conflict. In Grant Parish, things escalated when a black militia led by William Ward occupied the courthouse to protect the elected Republican officials. They saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
And knew things were about to get ugly.
And they were right, weren't they? The podcast mentions a black farmer being murdered.
Right.
And that really triggered this wave of fear with black families fleeing to the courthouse seeking safety.
Right.
It must have felt like a siege.
It was a terrifying situation. Then, on Easter Sunday, April 13th, Christopher Columbus Nash, the Democrat candidate for sheriff, issued an ultimatum to those in the courthouse. Surrender or face the consequences.
Wow.
You can imagine the tension,
Yeah.
the fear, the desperation of those inside.
They must have known what those consequences could be, and tragically, they were right to be afraid. Even though some accounts suggest the black defenders tried to surrender, Nash's men, many of them former Confederate soldiers, stormed the courthouse, set it on fire, and massacred those inside.
Yeah, the podcast details some truly horrific accounts of that day.
Yeah.
Men shot while begging for their lives. A freedman killed by his former owner.
Oh, my God.
It's estimated that as many as 150 black residents were killed at Colfax, compared to just 3 white men.
It's just mind-boggling, the scale of the violence. But here's what I think is just as disturbing. The lack of justice. I mean, almost 100 white men were indicted, but only a handful were ever actually charged.
Yeah.
With violating the Enforcement Act.
The Enforcement Act, just to clarify, was a federal law designed to protect the civil rights of black citizens. But as the Colfax massacre shows, the legal system at this time often failed to deliver justice, for black victims of violence. And that failure, that impunity, sends a very clear message.
It says that black lives don't matter, that white supremacy is still the law of the land, even after the Civil War and emancipation.
And that message wasn't lost on anyone. The Colfax massacre became a symbol of the escalating racial violence engulfing the South, a clear sign that Reconstruction was facing a dangerous turning point.
Right.
But this wasn't the only storm brewing. While all this was happening in Louisiana, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. That would have far-reaching consequences for Reconstruction. The Panic of 1873.
Right, the economic collapse. But before we get into that, the podcast highlights something I hadn't really considered before. The role of Northern public opinion in all of this.
Right.
It wasn't just about events in the South, it was about how those events were perceived and interpreted in the North. And one figure who really shaped that perception was journalist James S. Pike.
Yeah, Pike wrote a series of articles and a book called The Prostrate State, which painted a very negative picture of Reconstruction in South Carolina. He portrayed the Republican government there as corrupt, incompetent, and dominated by what he called black barbarism.
Black barbarism.
Yeah.
That language is so loaded, so clearly intended to stoke fear and prejudice in the North.
Uh-huh.
And it worked, didn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. Pike's writing, even though it was heavily biased, resonated with many Northerners who were already having second thoughts about Reconstruction. It tapped into existing anxieties about racial equality and played into this idea that black people were incapable of governing themselves.
So you have this dangerous narrative taking root. Reconstruction is failing and it's the fault of black people.
Right.
And then, as if things weren't bad enough, the Panic of 1873 hits.
Yeah.
I know this was a financial crisis, but explain it to me like I'm 5 years old. What exactly happened and why should we care about it in the context of Reconstruction?
Okay, imagine a house of cards suddenly collapsing.
Yeah.
That's essentially what happened to the American economy in 1873. The trigger was a banking crisis caused in part by reckless investments in railroad construction, which led to a domino effect of bank failures, business closures, and soaring unemployment.
Okay, that's a pretty vivid image. So the economy's in free fall, but what does this have to do with Reconstruction and the situation in the South?
Well, the Panic of 1873 had a devastating impact on everyone, but it hit black Southerners particularly hard.
Right.
Remember, many black families were just starting to build new lives after slavery.
Yeah.
Often working as sharecroppers, which meant they were already trapped in a cycle of poverty and debt.
And the podcast uses a really poignant example, right?
Right.
A black sharecropper in Alabama struggling to feed his family as cotton prices plummet after the panic. It brings home the human cost of this economic crisis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The Panic of 1873 gave even more ammunition to those who were already arguing that Reconstruction was a failure.
Yeah.
It allowed them to point to the economic hardship and say, see, this is what happens when you give black people rights, when you try to integrate them into society.
It's a classic scapegoating tactic. Blame the most vulnerable group for a complex problem they didn't create.
Right. And unfortunately, the strategy was very effective. The combination of the Panic of 1873, the rise of racist narratives like those pushed by James S. Pike, and the ongoing violence in the South all contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment with Reconstruction in the North.
So we're seeing a perfect storm forming one that will ultimately threaten to drown the hopes of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And as you said, the violence isn't going away.
Hope.
In fact, it's about to get even more organized and brazen.
And that's where we'll pick up next time. We'll look at how groups like the White League exploited the fear and uncertainty created by the Panic of 1873 to launch a campaign of terror aimed at overturning Reconstruction and restoring white supremacy in the South.
A chilling story, but one we need to understand if we want to grapple with the legacy of this pivotal moment in American history. See you in part 2.
As we saw in part 1, the stage was set for a backlash against Reconstruction. You know, the Kfax massacre showed just how far some were willing to go to maintain white supremacy, and the Panic of 1873 provided kind of an economic excuse to roll back progress. This is where groups like the White League really come into focus. They were determined to seize this moment of uncertainty and turn back the clock.
The White League, you mentioned them earlier, they were basically a paramilitary group, right? Like a more overt version of the Ku Klux Klan.
Exactly. Former Confederates largely. And they weren't afraid to show their faces. They operated openly with a clear goal to intimidate anyone who supported Reconstruction and to restore white democratic rule in the South.
And their tactics were brutal, weren't they? The podcast goes into detail about the Coushatta massacre in August 1874, which really shows how dangerous the situation had become for anyone, regardless of their race. Who dared to challenge the White League's agenda?
That's right. The Coushatta massacre really highlights the White League's strategy of targeting not just black Republicans, but also their white allies. It sent a chilling message. If you support black rights, you're a target, no matter who you are.
The story of the Twitchell family who are at the center of this massacre is just heartbreaking. Marshall Twitchell, a Union Army veteran, was a strong advocate for black rights and education. And because of that, his entire family became a target for the White League.
It's a clear example of how interracial cooperation, which was a key goal of Reconstruction, was seen as a threat by white supremacists. The White League used a trumped-up charge of a black uprising to incite violence, and they rounded up 6 white Republican officials, including some of Twitchell's relatives, forcing them to resign from office under threat of death.
It's just sickening. They promised these men safe passage out of town, but then they ambushed and murdered them in cold blood. And the violence didn't stop there. Back in Coushatta, white mobs killed 4 more black men.
The Coushatta massacre sent shockwaves throughout the nation. It showed just how far the White League was willing to go, and it put the North on notice. Reconstruction was under attack, and the federal government wasn't doing enough to protect it.
It seems like the White League was testing the limits, seeing how much they could get away with. And emboldened by their success in Cusada, they set their sights on an even bigger prize: New Orleans, the state capital.
Just 2 weeks after Cusada, in a move that would be unthinkable today, 3,500 members of the White League marched on New Orleans in broad daylight. Their goal was to overthrow the Republican governor, William Pitt Kellogg, and install the Democratic candidate.
And they actually managed to seize control of government buildings, including the State House and the Arsenal. It's hard to believe something like that could happen in the United States.
It really underscores the fragility of democracy, especially in a context of racial and political division. However, the White League's victory was short-lived. President Grant, under immense pressure from both sides, finally sent federal troops to restore order. The White League surrendered, and the Republican government was reinstated.
So it seems like a victory for Reconstruction, at least in the short term. But as the podcast points out, the damage was already done. The violence of 1874, especially the events in Louisiana, had a profound impact on the upcoming midterm elections.
Absolutely. The Democrats made significant gains in those elections, taking control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. It was a clear sign that Northern support for Reconstruction was waning. People were tired of the violence, tired of the stories of corruption, and many blamed the Republicans for the ongoing turmoil in the South.
And this political shift put immense pressure on President Grant. He was facing calls from within his own party to abandon Reconstruction altogether, to cut their losses and move on. It's a tragic irony, isn't it, that the party of Lincoln, but the party that fought to end slavery, was now being pressured to abandon the fight for racial equality.
It shows just how complex and challenging the project of Reconstruction was. And perhaps the most stark example of this political pressure and the difficult choices facing President Grant is his response to the 1875 Mississippi elections.
The Mississippi elections, that's where the Democrats really put their plan into action, right? The so-called Mississippi Plan.
Exactly. The Mississippi Plan was a blueprint for how to dismantle Reconstruction and restore white supremacy in the South. It involved a combination of tactics, including persuading white Republicans to switch sides, intimidating black voters, and unleashing violence against anyone who dared to support the Republican Party.
And the violence reached a horrifying climax with the Clinton massacre in September 1875. A Republican rally attended by thousands of black men, women, and children was attacked by armed Democrats. The podcast describes mothers running for their lives trying to protect their children. It's absolutely gut-wrenching.
The Clinton massacre was a turning point in Mississippi. It showed the world the true face of the redemption movement, the lengths to which white supremacists would go to regain control. And the violence wasn't limited to Clinton. Whiteliner groups, which were Mississippi's version of the White League, terrorized black communities throughout the state leading up to the election.
The governor at the time, Adelbert Ames, a Republican, pleaded with President Grant for help, but Grant refused to send federal troops. He was worried about the political consequences, especially with important elections coming up in the North.
And that decision had devastating consequences. The Democrats won the Mississippi election in a landslide amidst widespread voter intimidation and fraud. Mississippi was officially redeemed, which meant a return to white Democratic rule and the effective end of Reconstruction in the state.
It's a tragic story, but one that reveals so much about the challenges of that era. The hope of Reconstruction, the dream of a multiracial democracy, was being systematically crushed. But even in the face of this defeat, there was still one last glimmer of hope: the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875.
The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was a landmark piece of legislation, championed by figures like Charles Sumner, who had dedicated his life to fighting for racial equality. It was meant to outlaw racial discrimination in public accommodations like transportation and hotels.
It was a huge victory for civil rights activists, but as the podcast points out, it was also a bittersweet one. Congress, under pressure from those who opposed Reconstruction, stripped out some of the act's most important provisions, including a guarantee of equal access to public schools.
And perhaps most importantly, the act lacked real enforcement mechanisms. Without the power to enforce the law, it was essentially a symbolic gesture, a promise without teeth.
And just as the Civil Rights Act was being debated, another blow struck at the heart of black economic progress: the collapse of the Freedmen's Savings Bank in 1874.
This bank, chartered by Congress during the Civil War, was meant to help formerly enslaved people build wealth and achieve economic independence. But due to mismanagement and risky investments, it failed spectacularly.
The podcast describes the devastating impact of this collapse on Black depositors, many of whom lost their life savings. It was a betrayal of trust that had far-reaching consequences, both economically and psychologically.
The collapse of the Freedmen's Bank reinforced the message that even in freedom, Black Americans faced systemic obstacles and could not rely on the institutions that were supposed to protect them.
So as we enter the final part of our deep dive into Reconstruction, we're left with a sense of both progress and tragedy. The Civil Rights Act, while flawed, was a step in the right direction. But the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank and the violent rollback of Reconstruction in states like Mississippi showed just how vulnerable Black communities remained.
And the question becomes, what happens next? What does the future hold for the promise of racial equality in America? We'll explore those questions in part 3.
We've been on quite a journey through Reconstruction, haven't we? It seems like every time there's a glimmer of hope,
Yeah.
there's another setback, another tragedy. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering, what did it all ultimately mean? Was Reconstruction a failure?
That's a tough question. I mean, historians are still debating it today. On the one hand, Reconstruction did achieve some pretty significant successes.
Yeah.
Like it established a legal framework for Black citizenship
Right.
and political participation. Even though, as we saw, it was flawed in many ways, it also led to the creation of public schools in the South. And for at least a short time, Black communities experienced unprecedented levels of political power
Yeah.
and social mobility.
Those are real accomplishments, no doubt.
Right.
But it seems like those gains were so short-lived,
Yeah,
so fragile.
they were.
By the end of 1875, Reconstruction's falling apart.
Right.
Federal troops are being withdrawn. Democrats are taking over state governments across the South.
No.
And Black people are facing this resurgence of violence and disenfranchisement. It's almost like the promise of Reconstruction was betrayed.
Yeah, that sense of betrayal is something that resonates with a lot of people even today.
Yeah.
The events of Reconstruction raise some really profound questions. About the nature of democracy, the limits of reform, the deep roots of racism in American society.
And the American History Tellers episode really drives that point home, doesn't it?
It does.
It's hard not to see the parallels between the tactics used to suppress Black voters in the 1870s and, the efforts to restrict voting rights that we're seeing in some parts of the country today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The echoes of Reconstruction are still with us. The struggle for racial justice, for economic equality, for the full realization of the promise of democracy, that struggle is ongoing.
So what can we learn from all of this? I mean, it's a pretty bleak story,
Yeah.
but surely there are lessons we can take from it, insights that can help us as we grapple with similar challenges today.
Well, one key takeaway, I think, is that progress is rarely linear.
Yeah.
It's often met with resistance, with backlash. And as we saw with Reconstruction, those who hold power will often use whatever means necessary to maintain their control,
Right.
whether it's violence, economic pressure, legal maneuvering.
It's like that saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
Right.
It bends toward justice, but it doesn't get there on its own.
Exactly.
It takes constant effort, constant vigilance, constant struggle.
Exactly. And another lesson is that we can't afford to be complacent. We can't assume that the gains of the past are secure, that progress is inevitable. The dismantling of Reconstruction shows us just how quickly hard-won rights can be eroded, how easily democracy can backslide.
It's a reminder that we have to be active participants in shaping our society and holding our leaders accountable in fighting for the values we believe in.
Absolutely. And one final thought I'll leave you with is this. The story of Reconstruction is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's about understanding the roots of the challenges we face today and recognizing the ongoing struggle for justice and equality that continues to shape our nation.
That's a powerful message. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Reconstruction. It's been heavy, but it's also been incredibly insightful. We encourage you to keep exploring this era in American history and to consider how its legacies continue to shape our world today.